The air in Minjun Kang's penthouse office was a sterile, refrigerated thing, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive leather. It was an atmosphere Lena Roberts had learned to breathe, but it never felt like oxygen. For 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, she was the silent, efficient extension of the city's most feared and enigmatic figure. Her official title was executive assistant, but the whispers in the gilded hallways and the fear in the eyes of men in $1,000 suits told a different story. She worked for a king, a predator, the undisputed Korean Mafia boss of the city's sprawling underworld. The pressure was a physical weight, a constant tension in her shoulders. Today, it was unbearable. The demands had been relentless, a cascade of impossible tasks delivered in his clipped, chillingly calm voice over the intercom. Rear out a private jet out of a storm-locked airfield. Acquire a controlling interest in a tech firm by morning, discreetly. Cancel his reservation at a Michelin-starred restaurant and then, an hour later, demand it be reinstated for a party of 12. Each task was a test of her resourcefulness, her composure, her sanity. Now, finally, silence. The heavy mahogany door had clicked shut behind him 20 minutes ago, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Lena was left in the aftermath, a battlefield of paperwork and blinking notifications, under the silent judgment of the city's skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Her head throbbed, a dull, persistent drumbeat against her skull. She pushed her chair back, the soft whir of the casters on the polished marble the only sound. Her eyes, weary and bloodshot, drifted upwards, landing on the one object in the room that was more intimidating than the man himself, his portrait. It was enormous, a monument of oil on canvas, depicting Minjun Kang not on a throne, but seated in this very chair, his hands steepled, his gaze so unnervingly direct it felt like an accusation. The artist had captured the cold fire in his dark eyes, the severe line of his jaw, the almost imperceptible arrogance in his posture. It was the face of a man who had never been told no, a man who bent the world to his will with nothing more than a whisper. She felt a familiar surge of helpless frustration, a hot, bitter wave that rose in her chest. The silence was no longer a relief. It was an accomplice, allowing her anger to fester. She stood, her joints aching, and walked slowly toward the painting, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the dark, tailored suit of the painted Mafia boss. Lena stood before the monolith of canvas and oil, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. The painted eyes of Minjun Kang bored into her, a permanent, unblinking record of his authority. In the flesh, he was a quiet storm. In the portrait, he was the storm's eternal, captured wrath. The frustration that had been simmering all day began to bubble over, spilling out in a low, shaky whisper. "You know," she began, her voice a small, tight sound in the vast emptiness of the office. "For a man who demands clairvoyance, you are remarkably opaque." She took a step closer, emboldened by the sheer absurdity of her own actions. Arguing with a painting. It was official. This job had finally broken her. A 5 a.m. email with a single, cryptic line. "Handle the Yokohama shipment. Handle it how, Mr. Kong? Should I send flowers?" A strongly worded letter. "Do you want me to charter a boat myself and go down to the docks?" Her voice grew louder, shedding its whispery caution for a tone of pure, unadulterated exasperation. She began to pace in front of the portrait, her heels clicking a sharp, angry rhythm on the marble floor. "And the acquisitions. You want me to get a company's board of directors by sunrise, but you give me nothing. No leverage, no strategy. Just get it done. Do you think I have a magic wand hidden in my desk drawer? Am I supposed to mesmerize the CEO with my exceptional filing skills?" She threw her hands up in the air, a gesture of theatrical defeat aimed at the unmoving figure. "Of course not. Because you've already done the dark, terrifying part, haven't you? You've already made the calls, whispered the threats, moved the pieces. I'm just the final signature, the polite email that papers over the brutality of it all. The smiling, respectable face of your merciless ambition." Her breath was coming in short, sharp gasps now, the dam of her professional restraint crumbling piece by piece. She had spent 2 years in this ivory tower, a ghost in the machine of his empire, and he likely didn't even know her middle name. Her pacing became more agitated, a caged energy propelling her back and forth before the silent judge on the wall. The city lights began to flicker on, painting the office in strokes of neon and gold, but she didn't notice. Her world had shrunk to this room, to this one-sided confrontation. "And another thing," she said, pointing an accusatory finger at the portrait's stern face, "your coffee order. It is the bane of my existence. Single-origin Ethiopian beans, hand-ground, not by a machine, God forbid, brewed at precisely 94 degrees Celsius, with one, and only one, raw sugar cube, not two, not zero, one. I had to fire a courier service because the delivery boy's footsteps were, and I quote, rhythmically displeasing. Do you have any idea how insane you sound? Do you even taste the coffee? Or do you just enjoy the quiet suffering of everyone who has to procure it for you?" The question hung in the air, ludicrous and deeply felt. She stopped directly in front of the painting, her head tilted, her gaze analytical. The anger was beginning to cool, leaving behind a strange, aching curiosity. She let her eyes trace the severe lines of his face, the dark sweep of his hair, the complete absence of softness in his painted expression. "Who are you?" she asked, the question softer now, laced with genuine wonder. "When you're not being the terrifying Korean mafia boss, the corporate phantom, the man who makes billionaires tremble what's left. Is there anyone in there? Do you ever laugh? Do you ever look out at this city and feel anything other than ownership?" She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before lightly touching the ornate, gilded frame. It was cold as the glass wall, as cold as the man it depicted. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, not just for herself, but for him. A man so insulated by power and fear that the only person brave enough, or foolish enough, to speak to him honestly was his secretary, and even then, only to a two-dimensional effigy. The thought was so deeply pathetic it almost made her want to cry. The wave of emotion crested and broke. The anger, the frustration, the bizarre surge of empathy, it all coalesced into a single, reckless impulse. Her hand slid from the cold frame to the smooth, lacquered surface of the canvas. The artist had used a subtle gloss on his lips, giving them a faint, lifelike sheen. She looked into those unblinking, painted eyes, a storm of contradictory feelings raging within her. He was a monster, a tyrant, a man who moved through the world like a plague. He was also brilliant, disciplined, and possessed a gravitational pull she couldn't deny, even as she resented it. He was the architect of her misery, and the reason she could pay her mother's medical bills. It was a dizzying, impossible duality. "You are the single most infuriating, demanding, and captivating man I have ever met," she whispered, her voice thick with a confusing mix of resentment and fascination. "And I don't know whether to scream at you or, she couldn't finish the sentence. The words wouldn't come, so she acted instead. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated madness. A final, defiant act against the silent, oppressive power he held over her life. Rising onto the tips of her toes, Lena leaned forward, closing the small distance between her and the painting. She pressed her lips against the canvas, a firm, mockingly passionate kiss planted directly on the mouth of the painted Korean mafia boss. The act was absurd, a release of tension so profound it left her feeling lightheaded. It was a joke, a fit of pique, a secret rebellion no one would ever see. The faint smell of oil paint filled her senses. For a split second, there was only the smooth texture of the canvas and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, from the shadowed archway that led to his private study, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape of a leather shoe against marble. Lena froze, her lips still inches from the portrait. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she pulled back and turned her head. He was there. Not the painting. The man. Minjun Kong stood motionless, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the study, his hands in his pockets. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm, but his eyes, his very real, very alive eyes, were fixed on her, and she knew, with a certainty that stole the breath from her lungs, that he had seen everything. Minjun had returned for the schematics of the Nakatomi acquisition, a detail too sensitive to leave in the office overnight. He had entered through his private study, expecting the main office to be empty, save for the faint glow of his assistant's computer monitor. He had been about to call out to her when he heard her voice, small and tight with an emotion he rarely encountered, genuine anger, directed at him. He had paused in the archway, cloaked in shadow, his curiosity piqued. Listening to her was like discovering a secret document, a dossier on himself compiled by an unwilling biographer. He heard her rail against his impossible demands, her shockingly accurate imitation of his clipped tone, her detailed and passionate rant about his coffee. A muscle in his jaw twitched, not with anger, but with an unfamiliar flicker of amusement. No one spoke of him this way. To his face, they were obsequious. Behind his back, they whispered in fear. But this was raw, unfiltered, and astonishingly brave, even if its intended audience was inanimate. He had remained still, an observer in his own life, as her tirade softened into something more philosophical, more personal. "Is there anyone in there?" Her question echoed in the silent chambers of his own mind, a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. He had built this empire, this fortress of power, by systematically dismantling the man he used to be, replacing him with the cold, efficient machinery of the Korean Mafia boss. Then came the kiss. He watched her rise onto her toes, her form silhouetted against the glittering city, and press her lips to his painted image. The gesture was so profoundly unexpected, so utterly bizarre, it short-circuited every protocol in his mind. It wasn't an act of seduction, nor was it one of pure adoration. It was something far more complex, an act of defiance, of frustration, of a strange intimacy born from forced proximity and shared silence. It was the most honest thing he had witnessed in over a decade. He felt a crack appear in the icy facade he so carefully maintained. He should have been furious. He should have fired her on the spot for such an egregious breach of professional conduct. But he wasn't. He was intrigued, deeply. He chose that moment to shift his weight, the soft scrape of his shoe a deliberate announcement of his presence. He watched the blood drain from her face, the wide-eyed panic that replaced her defiant posture. He stepped out of the shadows, the ambient light catching the silver of his cufflinks, his expression a carefully blank canvas. He let the silence stretch, enjoying the palpable tension in the room. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes flicking from her terrified face to the portrait and back again. Finally, he stopped a few feet away and spoke, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Is there something you wish to discuss, Ms. Roberts?" Lena's mind went completely blank. All cognitive function ceased, replaced by a roaring static of pure, unadulterated panic. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a mortifying blush that she knew was visible even in the dim light. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled squeak emerged. She swallowed hard, trying to regain control. "Mr. Kong," she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper. I didn't know you were here. I thought you had left for the night."
I am so sorry.
"I was just tidying up." The lie was pathetic, ludicrous, and they both knew it. His gaze was unnervingly steady, his dark eyes missing nothing. He took another slow step forward, his presence filling the space, pressing in on her until the air felt thick and hard to breathe. He gestured vaguely toward the portrait. "Tidying up," he repeated, a faint, almost imperceptible note of amusement in his tone. "Your methods are unconventional." He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. He was taller than she realized, an imposing column of dark wool and quiet menace. "You seem to have several grievances," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, a silken threat. "Let's start with the Yokohama shipment. You had questions about my preferred method of handling it. Please, enlighten me." "I am always open to constructive feedback." Lena felt a wave of dizziness. This was a nightmare. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't firing her. He was doing something far worse. He was dissecting her, calmly, precisely, with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an insect. "No, sir," she stammered, wringing her hands. It was unprofessional. I was stressed. It was a lapse in judgment that will never happen again. I deeply apologize for my behavior. He ignored her apology, his focus absolute. And my coffee, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a terrifying sight. My distilled disappointment. You feel the suffering of the courier is too high a price to pay. An interesting moral position, he was quoting her. He had heard everything. Every single mortifying word. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, ready to give way. She had not only insulted her boss, the city's most powerful Korean mafia boss, but she had also revealed a deep well of personal frustration to a man who tolerated no weakness. She had sealed her own fate. The following week was a masterclass in psychological tension. Every buzz of the intercom made Lena jump. Every time he summoned her to his office, she was certain it was to dismiss her. But the final blow never came. Instead, the entire dynamic of their professional relationship had been subtly, irrevocably altered. He was still the same demanding, exacting employer, but something new had entered his gaze when he looked at her. It was a flicker of awareness, a glint of knowing amusement that made her skin prickle. He started speaking to her in person more often, his voice no longer just a disembodied command through a speaker, but a low, resonant presence in the room with her. One afternoon, he called her in to review a quarterly report. As she was about to leave, he stopped her. "Ms. Roberts," he said, not looking up from his computer. "The charity gala next month. The board has selected a Starry Night theme. Is that not derivative?" The question was so unexpected, so mundane. It caught her completely off guard. He was asking for her opinion. I suppose it has been done before, sir," she said carefully. He finally looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "What would you suggest?" Lena's mind raced. "Perhaps City of Gold," she ventured. Playing on the skyline, the lights. It's modern, sophisticated. He considered this for a moment, a thoughtful, unnerving silence filling the room. Acceptable, he finally conceded, turning back to his screen. Inform the board that small exchange felt more significant than any multi-million-dollar deal she had ever helped facilitate. This shift did not go unnoticed. Jae-wook, Min-jun's cousin and a man whose ambition was as sharp and obvious as his designer suits, observed their interactions with a hawk's intensity. He cornered Lena by the elevator one evening. "You seem to have captured the boss's attention," Jae-wook said, his smile a predatory slash. "Quite the accomplishment. Do be careful. His interest can be as fleeting as it is intense." The warning was clear, laced with a venomous jealousy that made Lena uneasy. The next day, Min-jun's test of her escalated. He handed her a thick, leather-bound file. It wasn't a schedule or a contact list. It was a prospectus for a new logistics company. "Read this," he ordered. "Tell me what you think. I want a perspective unclouded by greed or fear." He was bringing her closer to the heart of the machine, and Lena couldn't decide if it was a promotion or a death sentence. The crisis arrived without warning, a silent tremor that threatened to bring Min-jun's entire empire crashing down. It began with a series of minor but inexplicable setbacks. A key shipment was impounded at the port due to an anonymous tip. A city councilman, long in Min-jun's pocket, suddenly switched his vote on a crucial zoning permit. These were not coincidences. They were calculated strikes, evidence of a traitor in his inner circle. For days, a palpable tension gripped the penthouse office. Min-jun was a phantom of controlled fury, moving through the rooms with a predator's lethal quiet. His trusted lieutenants, men with scarred knuckles and dead eyes, were summoned for hushed, brutal meetings from which they emerged paler than they entered. He was hunting the snake in his garden, and his methods were ruthless. The betrayal was finally traced back to its source, Jae-wook. His cousin had been systematically leaking information to the rival Park clan, feeding them the weaknesses in Min-jun's operations in exchange for a promised seat at the head of a new, unified organization. The final piece of his treachery was a business proposal he had championed for weeks, the acquisition of a small shipping company called Triton Logistics. It was meant to be the Trojan horse, the legal instrument through which the Parks would gain a controlling foothold in Min-jun's primary legitimate enterprise. Min-jun was now isolated. Every man in his inner circle was now a potential suspect, tainted by their association with Jae-wook. He couldn't trust their counsel or their analysis. His usual tools, intimidation, violence, fear, were too blunt for this. He needed subtlety, a fresh pair of eyes that could see what his hardened soldiers could not. Late one night, long after the city had gone to sleep, he called Lena to his office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single desk lamp that cast long, menacing shadows across the walls. He stood by the window, looking down at the glittering sprawl below. He didn't turn when she entered. "I require your assistance," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual authority, replaced by a weary gravity. "I need someone who is not part of my world. Someone whose loyalty is not a currency to be bought or sold. I need to know, Ms. Roberts, can I trust you?" Lena's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against the sudden, heavy silence. The question was not a request, it was a weighing of her soul. In his world, trust was a commodity more precious and more dangerous than gold. To be trusted by the Korean Mafia boss was to be brought into the darkness, to stand on the edge of a precipice from which there was no retreat. But looking at his solitary figure outlined against the city lights, she didn't see the fearsome crime lord. She saw a man utterly alone, betrayed by his own blood. The memory of her foolish, one-sided conversation with his portrait flashed in her mind. She had demanded to see the man behind the mask, and now here he was. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a surprising, unshakable resolve. "Yes, Mr. Kong," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You can." He finally turned, his face half in shadow, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. He seemed to find none. He gestured to the thick file on his desk, the Triton Logistics proposal. The same one he had given her before. Jae-wook was passionate about this deal. "My men have reviewed it. They see a profitable acquisition. I see a knife in my throat. I need you to find the blade. For the next 48 hours, Lena worked with a singular, feverish focus. She wasn't a gangster or a forensic accountant, but she was meticulous, intelligent, and, as Min-jun had surmised, unburdened by the violent calculus of his world. She didn't look for threats of violence or hidden allegiances. She looked for what she knew: loopholes, clauses, and the subtle architecture of contractual language. She read every line, every footnote, every appendix. On the second night, fueled by coffee that she brewed herself, she found it. It wasn't in the main body of the contract. It was a barely noticeable addendum to a subclause on corporate governance, an article detailing the procedure for a tie-breaking vote on the board. The language was dense, deliberately convoluted, but the meaning was clear. In the event of a deadlock, the deciding vote would be cast by an independent arbiter, an arbitration firm that, after a few hours of deep-level digging, she discovered was a shell corporation owned entirely by the Park family. It was the Blade, a perfectly legal, bloodless coup hidden in plain sight. She brought her findings to Min-jun, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed out the innocuous-looking clause. He read it, his expression unreadable. Then he read it again, a slow, cold fury building in his eyes. He looked up at her, and in that moment, she saw the mask of the Mafia boss fall fully into place. It was terrifying, and it was magnificent. The aftermath was swift and silent. Jae-wook was summoned to a meeting from which he never returned. There were no public recriminations, no gangland wars that spilled onto the streets. Min-jun's retribution was a quiet, surgical excision, a message sent not with a shotgun blast, but with a terrifying, deafening silence that echoed through the city's underworld. The Park clan, their Trojan horse discovered and neutralized, retreated, their play for power utterly broken. The storm had passed. A few nights later, Lena was working late, finalizing the paperwork that would dissolve the Triton deal, when Min-jun entered her office space. He didn't speak, but simply stood there, watching her. Finally, she looked up. "It's done," she said softly. He nodded, walking past her into his own office, leaving the door open in a silent invitation. She followed him in. He was standing in front of the portrait, his hands clasped behind his back. The painting, which had once been the focus of her impotent rage, now felt like a relic from another lifetime. "That man," Min-jun said, his voice a low murmur as he stared at his own likeness, "is a construct. He is a shield. He is what they fear, and so he is what they respect. He must be cold, unflinching, and solitary. He turned his head slowly, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. You stood in this room, and you yelled at him. You demanded to see something else. And then you showed him a loyalty that was not born from fear. He took a step toward her, closing the space between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the gravity of all they had been through. He was no longer just her boss. She was no longer just his assistant. They were two people who had seen the truth of each other in a moment of crisis. For years, I have been surrounded by men who would kill for me, but who would also kill me for the right price, he continued, his voice raw with a vulnerability she never thought him capable of. Their loyalty is a transaction. Yours was a choice. I confess, I do not know what to do with such a thing. He reached out, not to touch her, but as a gesture, his hand hovering in the air between them. It was a question, an offering. Stay, Lena, he said, and the name on his lips was both strange and perfectly right. Do not stay as my secretary. Stay as my confidant. Stay with me. Lena looked from his outstretched hand to his dark, earnest eyes. She saw the empire, the danger, the cold, lonely world he inhabited. But for the first time, she also saw a space in it, a space that only she could fill. She took a step forward, closing the final distance, and placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. In the silent, glass-walled fortress high above the city, under the watchful eyes of a painted king, a new, quiet alliance was forged, not of power or fear, but of a connection as unexpected and profound as a kiss on a canvas.